He thought he had crafted the perfect life. Anthony Spencer, a man who clawed his way up the corporate ladder, stood at the pinnacle of New York society, his stunning new girlfriend, Tiffany, clinging to his arm. Tonight was his coronation, the exclusive St. Augustine Charity Gala. His ex-wife Maria was a distant, painful memory, a plain, simple woman he'd cast aside because she couldn't keep up. But as the grand doors of the ballroom swing open, a collective gasp silences the room. A woman of impossible elegance and poise commands the attention of every guest. And as she glides into the light, Anthony's perfectly crafted world begins to shatter. Because the woman is Maria, and the man escorting her, the man whose quiet power eclipses everyone in the room, is the one billionaire who could crush Anthony's entire existence without a second thought. The air in the back of the Maybach was thick with the scent of Tiffany's Chanel No. 5 and Anthony's own suffocating ambition. Outside, the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side reflected the city lights like a scattered handful of jewels. Anthony Spencer adjusted the crisp cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo, the weight of his Patek Philippe watch a comforting anchor on his wrist. It was a constant reminder of how far he'd come. "Are you nervous, baby?" Tiffany Dubois purred, running a perfectly manicured, blood-red nail down the lapel of his jacket. She was a vision poured into a glittering gold Kaufman Franco gown that left little to the imagination. Her hair, a cascade of blonde extensions, had taken 4 hours at the hands of a celebrity stylist. She was in every sense of the word an asset. "Nervous? Don't be ridiculous," Anthony scoffed, though a single bead of sweat traced a path down his spine. "Tonight is a victory lap. Being personally invited to the St. Augustine Gala, this means we're in. Sterling Coal Capital is finally playing in the big leagues, and so am I." Tiffany's smile was bright but vacant. She understood status in terms of labels and followers, not the subtle, brutal power dynamics of the world Anthony was desperate to conquer. The St. Augustine Charity Gala wasn't just a party. It was the apex of the New York social food chain. It was held annually in the celestial, cavernous halls of the New York Public Library, and the guest list was a curated collection of old money, new money, and the gatekeepers who decided which was which. To be here meant you had arrived. "I can't wait to get a picture with the Vanderbilts," Tiffany whispered already, angling her phone for the perfect selfie light. "My followers will die." Anthony sighed internally. He had traded up, he reminded himself. He had shed his old skin, and with it, his old wife, Maria. Just the thought of her name was like a dull, irritating ache. Maria Reyes. She had been with him from the beginning, back when his suit was from Men's Warehouse, and their apartment in Queens had a persistent leak in the ceiling. She'd worked 2 jobs to put him through his Wharton MBA, typed his papers, and believed in him with a quiet, unwavering faith that, in hindsight, felt more like a burden than a blessing. She was plain. It was a cruel word, but the only one that fit. Not ugly, but unadorned. She wore no makeup, preferred worn-out sweaters to designer dresses, and would rather spend an evening reading dusty history books than networking. She had a degree in classics from a decent state university, a fact he once found charming, but grew to see as utterly useless. As his career at Sterling Coal Capital ascended, her simplicity became an anchor dragging him down. He needed a partner who reflected his success, a Tiffany, not a Maria. The breakup had been brutal, a calculated move on his part. He'd called her a social liability. He still remembered her face, not angry or tearful, just empty, as if he'd scooped out whatever light had been there. She hadn't fought him. She'd simply packed her books, her old sweaters, and the framed photo of them from their college graduation, and disappeared from his life. He'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd moved to a small apartment downtown, working some menial job at a library or a museum. He felt a brief, fleeting pang of guilt, which he quickly smothered with the thrill of his newfound freedom. The Maybach purred to a stop in front of the library's majestic, lion-guarded entrance. A sea of flashing cameras and shouting paparazzi greeted them. Anthony stepped out, basking in the light, and smoothly helped Tiffany from the car. She posed, he smiled his arm possessively around her waist. They were the picture of modern success. Inside the scene was breathtaking. The Astor Hall was a symphony of marble gold leaf and the hushed, powerful murmur of the city's elite. Crystal glasses clinked a string quartet played Vivaldi, and the air hummed with deals being made and reputations being cemented. "Anthony, good to see you," a voice boomed. It was Marcus Blackwood, a managing director from a rival firm. Bold move, bringing the arm candy. He winked at Tiffany, who preened under the attention. "She's more than that, Marcus. She's the future Mrs. Spencer, Anthony said smoothly, the lie tasting like expensive champagne. Marriage was a business contract, and he hadn't yet decided if Tiffany's assets outweighed her liabilities. For the next hour, Anthony worked the room. He shook hands with tech moguls, nodded respectfully at silver-haired titans of industry, and expertly steered Tiffany away from making any conversational blunders. He was on top of the world. This was his kingdom, his reward for shedding the dead weight of his past. He had made the right choice. He was sure of it. Then the low hum of the room shifted, a subtle change in atmospheric pressure. Conversations lulled. Heads turned towards the grand entrance. A late arrival was always a power move, and Anthony craned his neck, curious to see which billionaire had deigned to grace them with their presence. And then he saw her. The woman standing in the grand archway was not a celebrity he recognized. She was tall, poised, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon that highlighted the graceful line of her neck. She wore a midnight blue Schiaparelli gown, a masterpiece of understated architecture that clung to her silhouette. Around her neck was a simple yet astonishingly brilliant diamond necklace that didn't shout its worth. It whispered it a secret only the truly wealthy would understand. But it wasn't the dress or the diamonds that made Anthony's blood run cold. It was her face. Older, yes. More defined, absolutely. The soft, unassuming lines had been replaced by a quiet, devastating confidence. The eyes that once held only gentle adoration for him now surveyed the room with a calm, discerning intelligence. It was Maria. Anthony's glass of champagne slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor, with a sound that seemed to echo the fracturing of his reality. Tiffany yelped, jumping back. But Anthony couldn't move. He could only stare. This was impossible. This couldn't be the same woman who used to wear his old university sweatshirts. This couldn't be the woman who cried when he told her she was holding him back. And then, the final fatal blow. A man stepped into the light beside her, placing a gentle, proprietary hand on the small of her back. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a bespoke suit, his presence radiating a power that made Anthony's hard-won status feel like a child's plaything. Anthony knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. Julian Devereux, the reclusive, enigmatic CEO of Ethelred Innovations. A man whose net worth was a subject of fevered speculation in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. A genuine titan, a kingmaker who could buy and sell sterling coal capital before his morning coffee. He didn't attend social events, ever, and he was here, with Maria, his ex-wife. The plain one. She smiled up at him, a genuine, luminous smile that Anthony hadn't seen in years, a smile he now realized had never not once been directed at him with such unfiltered joy. Julian Devereux leaned down and whispered something in her ear. She laughed, a clear musical sound that cut through the stunned silence of the room. And in that moment, Anthony Spencer knew his victory lap was over. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a jester in the court of a queen he had thrown away 5 years earlier. The world wasn't marble and gold. It was plaster and linoleum. Their first apartment in Sunnyside, Queens, smelled of old pipes and Maria's perpetual baking, oatmeal cookies, her comfort food. Anthony would come home exhausted from his entry-level analyst job, and she'd be there, her brow furrowed in concentration, not over a fashion magazine, but over a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. "How was your day?" She'd ask, her eyes clear and earnest-looking. Up from the page. "Brutal," he'd groan, dropping his briefcase. "Goldman Sachs is eating our lunch on the Bridgerton deal. You'll figure it out." She'd say, her faith in him absolute. "You always do." That faith was the fuel he ran on. Maria was his rock. When he decided to go for his MBA at Wharton, she didn't hesitate. She was working as a research assistant at the Columbia University Library, a job she loved, but that paid a pittance. Without a word, she took on a second job, waitressing on weekends at a dreary diner. "You don't have to do this, Ames," he'd said one night, watching her rub her aching feet. "Of course I do," she'd replied simply, looking at him as if the alternative was unthinkable. "This is for us, for our future." She was the architect of that future. She organized his study schedules, made flashcards for his finance exams, and proofread every single cover letter and resume he sent out. She had an uncanny knack for language, turning his clunky corporate jargon into sharp, compelling prose. When he landed the coveted internship at Sterling Coal Capital, she was more excited than he was. She celebrated by buying a $2 bottle of sparkling cider and making his favorite lasagna. He remembered her own dreams, spoken of only in quiet moments. She wanted to pursue a PhD in art history, to become a curator, to spend her life surrounded by the beauty and stories of the past. One day, she'd whisper, tracing the images in a heavy art book, "When you're settled and we're stable, I'll go back to school." Anthony had nodded and promised. "Anything you want, Ames. Once I make it, the world is yours." But making it was a moving target. The internship became a job. The analyst position became an associate. Their address changed from Queens to a respectable one-bedroom on the Upper West Side. With each promotion, Anthony changed too. The world he was entering was one of sharp suits, sharper wits, and wives who were as much a part of the corporate portfolio as the stocks they traded. He started noticing how other VPs' wives dressed, how they spoke, how they chaired charity committees, and knew exactly which fork to use. They were polished, formidable women. Then he would come home to Maria in her faded jeans and comfortable sweater, engrossed in a book about Etruscan pottery. Her quiet world, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. He started making excuses. "You wouldn't enjoy this, honey. It's just a boring work thing." He went to galas and networking events alone. He told her she looked tired, suggesting she stay home. Each excuse was a small chip at the foundation of their marriage. The shame was a bitter pill. He knew he was becoming a person she wouldn't recognize, a person he himself didn't always like. But the allure of the next rung on the ladder was too strong. He started seeing her not as his partner, but as a reflection of his own humble beginnings, a past he was desperate to outrun. The final conversation happened on a Tuesday. It was clinical, bloodless. He had practiced his speech in the mirror. He sat her down in their living room, the one with the IKEA furniture they'd assembled together years ago, which now looked cheap and flimsy to his newly discerning eyes. "Maria." He began avoiding her gaze. "This isn't working." She just looked at him, her hands folded in her lap. She seemed to know it was coming. "What isn't working, Anthony? Us. This. My life is moving in a different direction. I need someone who can move with it, someone who understands my world." "You think I don't understand it?" Her voice was quiet, dangerously so. "I helped you build it. You helped me study for exams, Maria." "That's not the same thing," he said, the cruelty of his words hanging in the air. "Look at us. I'm a vice president at Sterling Coal. When I go to these events, I need a partner who can contribute, network, fit in. You're brilliant in your own way, but your way is small, small." The word was a soft puff of air, but it landed like a punch. You don't care about the right things, the right people, the right clothes, the right conversations. You're content in this dusty little world of yours. I'm not. I'm sorry, but you've become a liability. Liability. That was the word that did it. He saw something in her eyes then, not hurt, not anger, but a shutter closing, a finality. The light he had always counted on being there for him was extinguished. She stood up. I see. I'll make sure you're taken care of, he said quickly, pulling out a pre-written settlement offer. It's very generous. She didn't even look at it. I don't want your money, Anthony. She walked into the bedroom and began to pack a single suitcase. She took her books, a few changes of clothes, and the photograph from their graduation. She left behind the jewelry he'd bought her, the designer purse she'd never used, the entire life he thought she'd wanted. As she stood at the door, suitcase in hand, she finally looked at him. You know the saddest part, Anthony? It's not that you're leaving me, it's that you have no idea what you're losing. And then she was gone. He had told himself it was for the best. He had dived headfirst into his new life, finding Tiffany within a month. Tiffany was perfect. She was a walking, talking billboard for his success. He'd convinced himself that Maria had probably faded back into obscurity, a mousy librarian somewhere, just as he'd predicted. He had never once considered the alternative. He had never once considered that the small dusty world she inhabited might have held more power and value than his entire gilded empire. He had forgotten her final words. Now, standing on the cold marble floor of the New York Public Library, watching her laugh with Julian Devereux, he finally understood. He had no idea what he'd lost. He had just thrown away a diamond because he was too busy collecting glitter. The whispers in the Astor Hall grew from a murmur to a wave. Phones were being subtly raised not to snap pictures of the established celebrities, but to capture the shocking tableau at the entrance. The sight of Julian Devereux at a social event was rare enough to be a headline. The sight of him with a mysterious, breathtaking woman was a seismic event. For the few who recognized that woman as Anthony Spencer's unassuming ex-wife, it was the stuff of legend. Anthony felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He could feel their pity, their schadenfreude. He was suddenly an object of ridicule. The man who had it all was now the man who'd thrown it all away. Who is that? Tiffany hissed, her perfectly applied lipstick twisted into a sneer of envy and confusion. And why is everyone looking at us? That's... Maria Anthony managed to choke out the name, feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. Tiffany's eyes widened in disbelief. She squinted across the room. That's your mousy ex-wife, the one who wore cardigans. No way. She must have had a ton of work done. And who is she with Julian Devereux? Anthony said, his voice flat. The name registered with Tiffany. Her jaw dropped. The Julian Devereux, the Ethelred Innovations guy, the one who was on the cover of Time magazine. But how? Why? The questions hammered at Anthony's skull. He watched as Maria and Julian began to move through the room. They weren't working it, not like he had been. They were simply present. People gravitated towards them. Old money matriarchs, whose icy glares could freeze a social climber at 20 paces, smiled warmly at Maria. Tech billionaires who usually traveled with an entourage approached Julian with a level of deference Anthony had never witnessed. Maria handled it all with an effortless grace that infuriated him. She spoke with a quiet confidence, her knowledge of art and history, the very things he'd dismissed as useless, now captivating the most powerful people in the city. She wasn't just a beautiful woman on a billionaire's arm. She was his equal. Anthony's pride, the very thing that had driven him to discard her, was now screaming at him to do something. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let her walk into his world and eclipse him so completely. He had to regain control of the narrative. Come on, he said, grabbing Tiffany's arm with more force than he intended. What are you doing? She yelped. I'm going to go to say hello, he said. His smile, a tight, predatory slash. He navigated them through the crowd, a shark sensing blood in the water, though he failed to realize it was his own. He intercepted them near the grand staircase. just as Maria was chatting with the curator of the Met. Well, 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 Anthony began, his voice oozing a false hearty bonhomie. Maria, I almost didn't recognize you. You clean up nicely. Maria's conversation with the curator paused. She turned to face him. Her expression was not one of shock or anger. It was one of mild, detached curiosity, the kind one might give to a slightly interesting, but ultimately insignificant insect. Julian Devereux's hand remained on her back, a silent, unmovable support. Anthony, she said, her voice calm and even. What a surprise to see you here. I could say the same about you. He shot back a smirk playing on his lips. He gestured vaguely at her expensive attire. Looks like you've done very well for yourself. Found a generous benefactor, I see. The insult was clear, crude, and designed to re-establish his dominance by painting her as a kept woman. Several people nearby fell silent, listening intently. Julian Devereux, who had been observing Anthony with a look of cold analysis, finally spoke. His voice was low and resonant, cutting through the air with absolute authority. I find it distasteful when a man attempts to take credit for a woman's success, and even more so when he attempts to diminish it. Anthony felt a chill. This was not a man to be trifled with. I'm just saying it's quite a transformation, Anthony stammered, trying to recover. It's not a transformation, Anthony Maria said, her gaze steady. It's a reclamation. I'm simply no longer hiding my light to make you feel more comfortable in your shadow. The verbal slap landed with precision. Before Anthony could retort, Tiffany, sensing an opportunity to assert her own value, stepped forward. Well, I think it's just wonderful that you found a hobby, she said to Maria, her tone dripping with condescension. Anthony told me you were always into old dusty things. It must be so fun to play dress-up and get taken to fancy parties. Maria looked at Tiffany, and for the first time a flicker of something, not pity, but perhaps amusement, danced in her eyes. It was Julian who answered, his tone dangerously soft. Maria's hobby, as you call it, is a bit more involved than that. Perhaps you missed the announcement in the Wall Street Journal last month. He paused, letting the silence hang. Anthony's mind raced. What announcement? He'd been so focused on his own deals, his own press. Julian continued, his eyes locked on Anthony. Ethelred Innovations recently endowed a new fund with a $200 million grant to acquire and revitalize the struggling Beauchamp Art Foundation. We needed someone with a unique combination of classical knowledge, historical perspective, and a sharp eye for undervalued cultural assets to run it. Someone who could see the soul in the old, dusty things. He smiled a thin, cutting smile. Allow me to introduce you to the new executive director of the Beauchamp Foundation, Ms. Maria Reyes, my fiancé. The word hit Anthony with the force of a physical blow. Not girlfriend, not companion, fiancé. The revelation rippled through the onlookers. Maria wasn't just a date. She wasn't a beneficiary. She was a director, a power player in her own right, helming a foundation with a budget that dwarfed Anthony's entire department's annual revenue. He had called her unambitious a liability, and she had, in the quiet years since he'd left, built an empire of her own in the very field he had mocked. Tiffany stood frozen, her catty remark having backfired in the most spectacular way possible. She had tried to belittle a woman who could now buy and sell her entire world. Anthony looked at Maria, truly looked at her, and saw a stranger. A formidable, brilliant, powerful stranger who had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. He had been so obsessed with the superficial glimmer of success that he had completely missed the solid gold right in front of him. And now that gold belonged to another man, a man who had been smart enough to recognize its true worth. The curator from the Met, who had been watching the entire exchange, smiled broadly at Maria. Director. Reyes, she said, her voice loud enough for all to hear. Now that the formalities are out of the way, you must tell me more about your plans for the new acquisitions. As Maria turned her back on Anthony, dismissing him as completely as if he were a piece of lint on her couture gown, and began an animated expert conversation, Anthony realized the night was no longer about him. He was a footnote in a story that was now and had always been about her. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from Antony's neck to his scalp. He was a ghost at the feast, invisible. The powerful figures he had spent the night courting now looked through him, their attention fixed on the new center of gravity in the room, Maria and Julian. He watched them move away, enveloped by a crowd of the city's true elite, leaving him and Tiffany standing alone in a wide, empty circle of shame. "Well, she's a bitch," Tiffany muttered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Who does she think she is?" "She's the executive director of the Beauchamp Foundation," Antony said numbly, the words tasting like ash. "And she's engaged to Julian Devereux." "So, you're a vice president." "You're important," Tiffany insisted, but her words sounded hollow, a desperate chant against an encroaching darkness. Antony knew the truth. His title, his bonus, his entire world was built on the perception of power. Julian Devereux didn't have to perceive power. He radiated it. In the ruthless calculus of this city, Antony was a soldier, and he had just tried to stare down a king. His mind was a maelstrom of rage, jealousy, and a terrifying, creeping sense of dread. How had this happened? How had the mousy, compliant woman he'd discarded transformed into this powerhouse? It didn't make sense. There had to be more to the story. It was Devereux. Devereux must have plucked her from obscurity, polished her up, and given her this title as a bauble. Yes, that had to be it. She couldn't have done it on her own. This rationalization was the only thing holding his shattered ego together. He needed to believe it. He needed to confront her again, alone this time. He needed to break through this new, infuriatingly calm facade and find the old Maria, the one who looked at him with wounded eyes. He saw his chance a while later. Julian was deep in conversation with a senator, his back to the main hall. Maria had stepped away onto one of the library's secluded marble balconies to take a moment looking out over the glittering expanse of Bryant Park. "Stay here," he instructed Tiffany, and strode towards the balcony, ignoring her plaintive cry of his name. He found Maria leaning against the balustrade, the cool night air gently rustling the silk of her gown. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She simply turned her head, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. "It's a beautiful view," she said, her voice calm. "Cut the crap, Maria," he snarled, dropping all pretense of civility. "What is this? What's the game?" "There's no game, Antony. Don't lie to me. You think I believe that story?" "Executive director. He gave you that title. He bought you this whole new life so he could have a pretty smart-sounding toy on his arm. You're no different from Tiffany. You just come with a better vocabulary." He wanted to wound her to see the flicker of pain that would prove he still had some power over her. Instead, she just looked at him with a profound, weary sadness. "Is that what you need to believe to sleep at night?" she asked softly. "That my success couldn't possibly be my own, that it has to be the gift of a powerful man. That's your narrative, Antony. It was always your narrative. A woman's worth is only a reflection of the man she is with. It's the truth." He insisted, his voice rising. "You were nothing when I left you. You were working in a library, for God's sake." "Yes, I was," she said, her voice gaining a steely edge. "After you left, I was heartbroken. Not because I'd lost you. I think I'd lost the man I married long before that. I was heartbroken because I had poured everything I was into a vessel that was hollow. So I went back to the only thing that was truly mine, my work, my passion." She took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his. "I took a job in the archives of the Beauchamp Foundation. It was quiet, it was dusty, and it was heaven. I spent 2 years there surrounded by history. And in those archives, I made a discovery. I found proof that several paintings in their collection, long dismissed as copies, were in fact early works by the Renaissance master, Bellini, misattributed. For centuries. I wrote a paper. It was published. It caused quite a stir in the art world." Antony stared at her dumbfounded. He'd never read an art journal in his life. He had no idea. My discovery brought the foundation a lot of attention. She continued, her voice steady and sure, including the attention of Julian Devereux, who, as you may know, is a passionate and very serious art collector. He wasn't looking for a pretty toy Anthony. He was looking for an expert. He sought me out. We talked for hours about art history and philosophy. He saw my mind before he ever saw me in a gown. The directorship wasn't a gift. I earned it. The endowment from his company was a result of the strategy I proposed to him for the foundation's future. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Anthony's delusion. Her success wasn't borrowed. It was forged in the very fires of the passion he had mocked. His face contorted in a sneer of disbelief. You got lucky. You found some old paintings. That's not building a career. Was it luck, Anthony? She asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Or was it knowledge? The same way you got lucky with your first big trade at Sterling Coal. The one that put you on the map. Anthony froze. The trade. The one that had made his career. A risky bet on a small emerging biotech company. It had been his first multi-million-dollar win. It was the foundation of everything that followed. What about it? He said defensively. Maria's eyes were filled with an ancient, sorrowful knowledge. Do you remember right before we broke up, my Aunt Carol passed away? Anthony had a vague recollection. Maria had been sad for a week. He'd been annoyed it was distracting her from his needs. Yeah, so... She didn't have much, Maria said, but she left me everything she had. It was $50,000. Not a life-changing amount, but it was everything to me. A week later, you came home panicking about needing to secure a personal stake in an investment pool for that biotech company, Synthogenetics. And you said you needed $50,000 by the next morning, or you'd lose the opportunity of a lifetime. The blood drained from Anthony's face. He remembered. He remembered desperately needing the capital to get in on the deal. He had maxed out his credit cards, but it wasn't enough. I remember you telling me your bonus had come through. Early, Maria continued, her voice a quiet indictment. You seemed so relieved. The lie he had told, buried under years of self-aggrandizement, was suddenly unearthed. He hadn't gotten an early bonus. The money he'd used. That $50,000, Anthony Maria said, her voice breaking with the weight of the old betrayal. The money that launched your entire career. The foundation of this life you're so proud of. It wasn't your bonus. It was my inheritance. I transferred it to your account that night while you were sleeping because I still believed in us. I still believed in you. You never even noticed it was gone from my savings. You never asked. You just took the win and kept climbing. The world tilted on its axis. He had built his kingdom on her grief. He had taken the last piece of her past and used it to fund his future, a future that explicitly excluded her. His great success wasn't his at all. It was hers. The ultimate liability, the small woman he'd cast aside, had been the silent, uncredited investor in his entire life. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to say anything, but no words came. There was nothing to say. The lie was too big, and the truth was too damning. He was a fraud, and the one person in the world who knew it was standing right in front of him, no longer his victim, but his judge. The silence on the balcony was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the frantic hammering of Anthony's heart. The foundation of his identity, the self-made man, the corporate shark, the master of his own destiny, had crumbled into dust. He wasn't a builder. He was a thief. You're lying, he whispered, but the words had no conviction. The memory, sharp and sickening, was resurfacing. The panic, the desperate search for funds, and then the sudden miraculous appearance of the exact amount he needed in his account. He had told himself it was a bank error in his favor or an early bonus processing. He had deliberately chosen not to question it, not to look too closely, because the hunger for success had been all-consuming. Why would I lie? Anthony Maria's voice was devoid of malice. It was worse. It was full of a devastating clarity. What would be the point? I'm not telling you this for revenge. I'm telling you so you understand. The life you have isn't something you built in spite of me. In many ways, you built it because of me. The least you could do is have the grace to own that. Grace. He had no grace left. Only a raw primal fury born of total exposure. He was a fraud, and she knew it. Julian Devereux, a man whose respect he craved, was just meters away. If he found out, "You're going to tell him," Anthony accused, his voice low and venomous. "You're going to tell everyone and ruin me." "Ruin you?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "You think I've spent the last 5 years plotting your downfall? Anthony, you haven't been a character in my story for a very long time. You're a footnote in the prologue. This isn't about you. This was never about you." Her dismissal was more painful than any threat. To be so insignificant to her, after he had made her the villain in his own story for so long, was the ultimate degradation. His mind snapped. The carefully controlled facade of the cool-headed VP shattered, and the desperate, insecure man from Sunnyside, Queens, clawed his way out. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm. "You owe me. Everything you are now is because I pushed you away. I motivated you. I made you who you are." Maria flinched, not in fear but in shock at his crudeness. "Let go of me, Anthony. You will not dismiss me." He seethed, his grip tightening. "You think you're better than me now with your billionaire and your fancy title? You're still the same little girl from the state university who got lucky. I think you've made your point." The new voice was quiet, yet it carried the chilling authority of a death sentence. Julian Devereux stood at the entrance to the balcony. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His eyes, fixed on Anthony's hand, clamped around Maria's arm, were colder than the marble floor. Anthony snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. We were just talking." Julian ignored him completely. He walked to Maria's side, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Are you all right, my love? I'm fine," she said, her composure returning instantly in his presence. She straightened the sleeve of her gown. Julian then turned his full, undivided attention to Anthony. The ambient power that usually radiated from him was now focused into a laser beam of pure Arctic contempt. "Spencer," he said the name, sounding like something distasteful he was scraping off his shoe. "I have seen men of ambition and men of desperation. It is a rare and pathetic thing to see a man who is so nakedly both." Anthony felt his throat close up. This was it. The end. "I was under the impression that Sterling Cole Capital valued discretion and professionalism in its senior partners." Julian continued, his voice a silken threat. "I imagine their board and their clients, many of whom are my personal friends, would be concerned to learn that a senior vice president conducts himself like a common thug publicly harassing women at a charity function." Every word was a perfectly aimed shot. Julian wasn't just threatening Anthony's social standing. He was threatening his entire career. A single phone call from this man, a whispered word at the right golf club, and everything Anthony had worked for would be gone. The deals would dry up. The invitations would stop. His name would become poison. "Now I am going to escort my fiancée back to the party," Julian said, his eyes boring into Anthony's. "And you are going to vanish. I don't want to see your face again tonight. I don't want to hear your name. If you so much as breathe in Maria's direction again, I will not call your board of directors. I will call my lawyers, and we will embark on a forensic audit of every deal you have ever touched. I assure you, Mr. Spencer, no one's past is clean enough to survive that kind of scrutiny. Least of all yours." The veiled reference to Anthony's financial history, a history Julian couldn't possibly know the sordid details of yet, seemed to intuit with terrifying accuracy, was the checkmate. Anthony stood paralyzed, drenched in a cold sweat. He had come here tonight a king. He was leaving a condemned man, his sentence delivered not by a court of law, but by a court of power. He had no hope of appealing. Julian placed a hand on Maria's back. his gesture a stark contrast to Anthony's earlier violent grab. It was protective, respectful. "Come, Maria, Miss Zastor Vanderbilt was just asking about your Bellini research." As they turned to leave, Maria paused and looked back at Anthony one last time. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hatred, only a deep, profound pity. It was the look one gives to a relic of a forgotten past, an artifact of a life long since moved on from. Then she turned and walked away, with her future leaving Anthony alone on the balcony with the ruins of his. The great Anthony Spencer, reduced to nothing more than the villain in someone else's success story. He had tried to play chess with the gods of Manhattan, and they had just swept him from the board. The walk back into the Grand Hall was the longest of Anthony's life. The whispers that had been subtle before were now open, the stares pointed and merciless. The news of the confrontation on the balcony, undoubtedly overheard, and already spreading like wildfire, had sealed his fate. He was a social leper. He found Tiffany right where he'd left her, looking frantic. "Anthony, what happened? People are saying Julian Devereux threatened you." "Get your coat," he said, his voice a hollow rasp. He didn't look at her. He couldn't look at anyone. "But the party's not over." "We haven't even had dessert," she protested, the triviality of her concern, a grating insult to the magnitude of his ruin. "The party is over for us," he snapped, grabbing her arm and pulling her towards the exit, past the smiling faces that now seemed to mock him. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He knew what he would see: Maria surrounded by light and laughter, holding court in a world that had once been his ultimate goal, a world he had now been permanently exiled from. The ride home was silent. Tiffany, for once, seemed to understand that her usual chatter would be unwelcome. The scent of her perfume, which had seemed so glamorous hours ago, now smelled cloying and cheap. The Maybach felt like a hearse carrying the corpse of his ambitions back to an empty penthouse that felt more like a tomb than a home. He walked into his apartment and went straight to the bar, pouring a large glass of Macallan 25. He downed it in one gulp, the burn in his throat doing nothing to erase the icy dread in his stomach. He was done. Julian Devereux was a man of his word. By morning, the calls would begin. His superiors at Sterling Coal would summon him. His career was over. And for what? For a pride so fragile it couldn't bear the thought of his ex-wife's success. Tiffany watched him, her face a mask of anxiety. "Anthony, talk to me. Is it really that bad?" He finally looked at her perfectly constructed beauty, her expensive dress, her vacant eyes. She was the trophy he had wanted, the symbol of his arrival. And now she was just a painful reminder of the terrible trade he had made. He had traded substance for surface gold, for glitter. He had traded Maria for this. "Yes, Tiffany," he said, his voice flat and dead. "It's that bad." Across town, in the back of a discreetly elegant Rolls-Royce, Maria leaned her head against Julian's shoulder. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a quiet sense of peace. The diamond necklace he'd given her felt warm against her skin. "Are you sure you're all right?" Julian asked again, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I am," she said, and she knew it was true. For years, a part of me felt defined by the way he left me, as if his judgment of me was the final word. Tonight I realized it was just his opinion, and his opinion doesn't matter. "It never did," Julian said softly. "I knew who you were the moment I read your paper on Bellini. Before I even met you, I knew I was dealing with a mind of immense beauty and integrity. The rest was just a very, very welcome bonus." She smiled, a real unburdened smile. "He built his whole career on my inheritance." She had told Julian the full story on the way out of the gala. He had listened patiently, his expression hardening only slightly. "I know," he said. Maria looked up, surprised. "You know, I suspected," he clarified. "When I decided you were going to be a part of my life, I had my security team do a standard confidential background check on both of you for your protection." The $50,000 transfer from your account to his, one day before he made the defining trade of his career, was a rather glaring flag. I never mentioned it because it was your story to tell or to keep. But know this, if he had harmed you tonight in any way, I would have used that information to ensure he never worked in this hemisphere again. Maria felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest. It was the feeling of being truly seen, truly protected, not out of ownership, but out of deep, abiding respect. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." "Always," he replied, lifting her hand to his lips. "So, Director Reyes, now that we've survived the New York social scene, what's next on your agenda for world domination?" She laughed. The sound free and light. "First, I plan to acquire the lost collection of the Marquis de Sensé. Then, after a brief stop in Florence to authenticate a newly discovered sketch by Da Vinci, I was thinking we could finally take that trip to Greece you promised me. I want to show you the Parthenon at sunrise." He smiled, his eyes full of adoration. "An empire of beauty and knowledge. I like it." "And our home base?" Maria looked out the window as the Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb, not in front of a cold penthouse, but a beautiful stately brownstone on a quiet tree-lined street in Gramercy Park, their home. "I think we're already there," she said. She had walked into that gala tonight, nervous and uncertain, half expecting to still feel the sting of her past. But she walked out free. Her triumph wasn't in Antony's ruin, but in her own becoming. She hadn't needed to shut down the night. By simply being herself, the night had rearranged itself around her. Antony Spencer hadn't been defeated by a billionaire's power or a beautiful gown. He had been defeated by the quiet, unyielding power of a woman who finally knew her own worth. In the end, this wasn't merely a story of revenge. It was a profound narrative of reclamation. It serves as a powerful reminder that the brightest spotlights we can ever stand in are the ones we generate from within. Antony Spencer's life, for all its outward gloss and glamour, was a gilded cage built on a stolen foundation, a house of cards destined to collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty. He chased external validation, viewing people as assets and liabilities, and in his blindness, he tragically miscalculated the true worth of the woman beside him. Maria's journey, in stark contrast, was a quiet renaissance. She didn't seek to outshine Antony in his world. She simply reignited her own. Her power wasn't found in a designer gown or a billionaire's affection, but in the silent archives of a library, in the rediscovery of her passion, and in the unshakable confidence that comes from embracing your own intellect and spirit. Her triumph teaches us that authenticity is the ultimate superpower. What was the true moment of Antony's downfall? Was it when he left Maria, when he confronted her at the gala, or the second he decided her inheritance was his for the taking? Do you believe a person like Antony can ever truly understand what they lost? Let's discuss this story of poetic justice in the comments below. If you were moved by this tale of empowerment and the quiet victory of substance over surface, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video, and subscribing for more compelling stories where true character is the ultimate fortune.